One of the biggest challenges in React is finding unnecessary renders and fixing render performance issues. Even teams at major companies still struggle with this. But there's a powerful new tool that makes finding and fixing these issues 100 times easier. Meet React Scan, a free tool from Million. You might know Million for their suite of other React optimization tools, some of them free, some of them paid for, but luckily React Scan is completely free. Let me show you how it works right here with that demo. You can see if I click show demo, we get a few boxes highlighting on the page. And if I type something in here like subscribe to Better Stack, something you should do, you can see we got a load of different boxes that were highlighted. This indicates that the components are being re-rendered whenever we change something in this input. And you can see if I click add, that will also occur as well. We also get this nice floating tool up here, but I'm going to go ahead and add this to my own app so we can explore this a little bit more. React Scan is super flexible to install. You can actually add it as a script tag, you can install it through npm, you can use that CLI, or you can even install a browser extension to do it. I'm going to be using the script tag method. So all I need to do is copy this line from that GitHub and paste it into my index.html, and we should be good to go. As you can see, we've now got this React Scan floating tool on my demo site here. Now I've built this demo site to purposely have some common React re-rendering pitfalls. You can see if I click this increment button, we get a lot of components re-rendering. You can see the super increment button re-renders, usernames, and even user profile. Now user profile is in red there because it's actually a component that's slowing down quite a bit. You can see the number coming in there next to the user profile, and it shows that we're already at 6 seconds of rendering time. You can also see up here the FPS drops massively for this page when I increment that button. In fact, if I held down enter on the button, it would actually cause the page to start to lag out. So we definitely have some issues here. Another thing you might notice on the React Scan tool is you can actually make it play a noise for each re-render. So if I click increment here, you can see you get a nice little noise indicator as well, which can just help you know that there's an issue. The other really powerful one though is this inspect element tool. If I click inspect element here and I click on user profile, I can now see the reason that it re-rendered. You can see if I click increment here, it's telling us that the theme prop is always changing. And in fact, it even highlights that we might need to optimize this. So let's go ahead and do that. Over in the code for the user profile component then, you can see we take in one prop of the theme there, and we saw that was the one that was changing, but we also have an object inside of here called user, and then we have a computed value. This computed value contains an extremely expensive function. So this is the one that's actually slowing down our website. Now imagine for a second this isn't a function that we could optimize, but we do know it always gets the same output for the same input. Well, we can reach for one of our first React hooks, which is useMemo. UseMemo is good for objects and arrays, which is the return value we want in this case with that computed value. All we need to do is wrap some piece of work inside of the useMemo function. So instead, we'll say const user here, that's going to equal to useMemo, that's imported from React. And then inside of here, you call a function, which just returns the new value that you want. So I'll call this function and I'll wrap that computed value and also the user object inside of it. We need to go ahead and just change this to return so we can set the user object up here. And then finally, we need to pass it a dependency array. Well, this dependency array is telling React is only go ahead and recompute this logic when this value changes. And since we use theme inside of this logic, we need to go ahead and update the value only when theme itself changes. So with what we just learned about useMemo then, this value shouldn't be being recalculated, right? Well, unfortunately not. You can see if we click increment, it still shows up red and it's still slowing down the page quite a bit. There's another reason for this. Again, if we inspect the element, you can see it's because it considers theme as changing, despite the fact that these look like static values. So we need to go a step further. If we go one level up in our component tree then, that's to the app.tsx, you can see we're using that user profile component here, and it's being passed the theme as theme object. You can see that's just this static object that we have here. So why is that being considered a new prop each time we pass it? Well, that's because of the way that React rendering works. When we update this count up here, this entire app.tsx component is going to re-render. That means everything inside of here is recreated, including this object. So even if the object looks the same as the previous value, it's technically a new object. What we need to do instead is use useMemo again to tell React to use the value from the previous render if nothing has changed. So on theme object here, we can do essentially the same thing. We can go ahead and say useMemo instead. And then in here, we can just simply call a function that really quickly returns this object. Now we pass it a dependency array. Again, that's going to be for the theme. And now we can go ahead and save this. So does this work? Well, the answer is kind of. You can see if I click the increment button here, the user profile is still being re-rendered, but it's no longer being highlighted in red, and it takes barely any time at all. That's because the expensive computation is now being cached using our useMemo, but the user profile component itself is still re-rendering. This is due to how React rendering works. React actually never re-renders because a prop changes, it only re-renders because state changes. So when the count state up here changes, the entire app component re-renders, so everything gets recreated or it gets recalled unless we wrap it in useMemo. What this means is the user profile component down here is actually being rerun as a function, but since we know that theme is the same as the last value, it's not going to rerun this expensive computation. Now, if you actually wanted to stop it re-rendering entirely, you can go ahead and memoize the entire component. To do that, all you need to do is wrap user profile in memo like this. And what this says to React is this is now a pure component, never re-render it unless the prop itself changes. So if we go ahead and save that, if we now hit increment, you can see user profile is no longer being re-rendered when that counter goes up. Now there's one other hook we can use, and that is useCallback. This is pretty much the exact same thing as useMemo, but it's made to be a little bit nicer when working with functions. It's only really a syntax change. We go ahead and hit increment over here, you can see the super increment button is also re-rendering. We can find out why by inspecting the element, and you can see it's the prop of handle click that needs to be optimized, as that's the one that is changing. What you can see in the big increment component is I've already wrapped it in memo. This means that it's a pure component and it shouldn't be re-rendering unless the props change. So let's find out why handle click is changing. Again, if we go back to app.tsx, we can see we have the handle big increment function here, and that's what's being passed through as the prop for that handle click. As we learned earlier with React though, every time this state changes, this entire function reruns, and that means anything inside of here is recreated, including this function. So it's technically a new function, despite the fact that it does the exact same thing. To fix this, we can do what we did with useMemo, but instead use callback. All we need to do is change this function to simply say useCallback, and then inside of here, we just wrap the entire function itself, and we pass it a dependency array to say, when do we actually want to recalculate this function? In our case, this doesn't actually rely on anything. Since I'm using setCount in here with the previous setter method, I don't need to make it rely on count. Now that we've done that, if I click increment over here, you can see that super increment is no longer re-rendering. There's one final re-render to fix then, and that is that usernames component there that says subscribe to the channel. You can see if we go ahead and inspect this, that it's the usernames prop that is always changing. Now that's interesting because if we go to usernames here, you can see that's just coming from this static local array. But remember again, everything we just learned is that React goes ahead and recreates this array, even if it's the exact same thing, so it's technically a different array. Our solution for this is just to use that useMemo hook. So we can simply change this to useMemo and then return a function that really quickly just returns the array. And then inside of here, we can also pass it a dependency array, and that's just going to be an empty array for us since nothing has to change. And we can go ahead and hit save. Now we hit increment, you can see that component is no longer updating. Now I want to make something clear here. I'm not recommending you go and optimize every single re-render for every component. You'd actually just be wasting your time as the performance gains are minimal in most cases. Re-renders aren't actually that so because funnily enough, the React team has made them super optimized. You should be using these hooks when you notice a slowdown or a problem like we had in the earlier case with that user info object and the user profile component. But realistically, I would have actually stopped with optimizing that component itself. Even more realistic would be to restructure your component tree. There's a great article from Dan here who explains what you should try before you use useMemo or useCallback. If I apply that to our code base, it would look like this. What I've done here is I've moved that counter state down. So I've created a new counter section component, and then inside of here, that's where I'm handling that count state. This means that as we increment count, this is the only component that is going to re-render when that occurs. So if I click increment here, you can see this counter section component is re-rendering. That's also causing the big increment component to re-render as well though. But in my case, I personally wouldn't even go in and optimize that big increment component because as you can see, it's such a simple component, the performance gains would be absolutely minimal. The other cool thing about this is I haven't used a single useMemo, useCallback, or memoization of a component at all in this new code base. Just because I've moved my state around now, we know that user profile isn't going to re-render anymore unless theme state changes, and that's the only state that causes that re-render. It won't be caused by incrementing that counter. So you can see if I hit toggle theme, it does re-render user profile, but hitting increment, we're not getting any re-renders there. And as I said earlier, if we click inside of this, you can see there's no memoization, there's no useMemo, no useCallback in any of these components anymore. So that's the first thing that you should try when you want to optimize your components. I'll leave a link to that blog post in the description down below. The other thing you could do is reach for a state manager like Redux or ZooStand. This is just going to ensure that your state is only causing re-renders where it actually matters. And then lastly, another thing to note is React is actually working on a React compiler, which is going to aim to auto-memoize your code for you. So in the future, you may rarely even need to use the useMemo and useCallback hooks. That's going to be super cool to see. I hope you try out React Scan and that you learned something new about React rendering today. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And as always, see you in the next one.